A poem. I am a camera woman. I think of myself sometimes as a form with a camera for a brain. This form is taking pictures of what is right in front of me all the time. And lately, I've gotten better at using this camera. If I'm in right relationship with my camera, I can choose the aperture, the focus, the shutter speed. I can wait for the light or take a shot in the dark. I don't just get in line with everybody else and take the money shot. I use discretion. I use memory, the photographs I've taken before, my preference for the intimate or for drone footage when the landscape asks for it. I use discernment. I use care as a mother does or a teacher does. Not toward the improvement of reality, but to become a more faithful witness to it. Some days when I must care deeply for one small thing, I narrow the aperture. The world grows sharp, but very small. So I can give all of my attention to the thing before me and try to help it grow. Other days, I open it wide. I welcome sky, clouds, trees, houses, bodies, traffic, buildings, grass, flowers, mailboxes, signs, and lights. I don't want to miss a thing. I want to step outside my private experience and borrow the view from my brothers and sisters who live beside me. And then, sometimes, so much light pours in that everything disappears into brightness. I've flown too close to the sun. There is such a thing as trying to hold so much forest, the trees are forsaken. There is such a thing as focusing so completely on a blade of grass that it becomes a universe unto itself. Both are forms of blindness. The art is not to capture everything, everywhere, all the time, nor is it to photograph only my private reality. It is to remain in right relationship with what appears, and to widen the aperture without losing the person standing in front of me, to narrow it without mistaking my focused attention in this moment for the whole world's needs. Every photograph is a confession. This is what I noticed. This is what I loved. This is what I could bear to see. Every photograph will leave something out of the frame. Let me not forget that. I'm not trying to make or take a perfect picture. only to come into a more perfect union with the truth. Welcome into season 3 of Ethical Adulthood with Andrea Fiondo. I wrote that poem a few days ago. At the time, I thought it had simply grown out of an article I'd read about some billionaire doing his billionaire thing. I didn't realize I was writing the preface to today's episode. Today's episode is called Capacity Zero, the capacity for complexity and the ability to admit increasing complexity while remaining in contact with reality. A few days ago, I read an article that left me unsettled. Not because I disagreed with it, not because I was appalled by it, and not really because of the person the article was about, the aforementioned billionaire. What unsettled me was something else. I found myself wanting to understand how someone so effective as a human being, so successful as to own multiple homes, planes, yachts, infrastructure, and companies, how a person so brilliantly adapted to what our present world rewards so generously could lose contact with ordinary human life. How does someone become so intelligent, so successful, so influential that kindness, justice, equality, and care begin to look theoretical and therefore incidental to them? I started thinking about the drone footage. I appreciate the earth porn available now because of these wonderful cameras exist. The higher you fly, the more you can see. Patterns emerge. Connections become obvious. The landscape tells a story you couldn't possibly see from the ground. That's real. But from high enough, the people in the streets begin to disappear. They blur into movement, into statistics, into markets, into history, into theory, really, as you can't actually see them anymore. The higher the drone climbs, the easier it becomes to forget that every dot in the landscape is someone standing in line at the grocery store or sitting beside a hospital bed or worrying how they're going to pay next month's rent. And I thought, wait, holy crap, Batman. Then the uncomfortable question arrived, do I ever do the same thing? Not in the same way, perhaps. Money really does change a person in ways I'm not sure I'll ever intimately understand. But do I ever become so attached to my current map of reality, so fascinated with seeing the whole landscape, that I stop seeing the person standing right in front of me? Because if billionaires can do it, psychologists can do it, yoga teachers can do it, Podcast hosts can do it. Parents can do it. Every photograph leaves something outside the frame. Let me not forget that. When I first wrote the Ethical Adulthood essay, I was writing from my own life. I was reasonably well-resourced, well-educated, psychologically literate. I was trying to understand my own relationships and the political climate I was living through. Those pressures gave rise to the 5 capacities. Not because they're the only capacities that mattered, but because they seemed to me to be the most common capacities required to do less harm, remain in better contact with reality, and live an ordinary life a little more honestly. And over time, though, the project evolved. It had to. I began thinking about people who still lived with certainty, people who weren't well-resourced, people who were overwhelmed, people trapped between impossible choices, people living everyone else's lives instead of their own. Then I spent a month recording a Detroit soundtrack, and I realized something. I wasn't really talking about music. I was talking about perception, about the camera, about the way each of us sees the world. And then this article appeared, and I couldn't stop wondering why seemingly ordinary people sometimes lose contact with reality itself. Not reality in the sense of facts, reality in the sense of the people inhabiting the facts. That's when I realized something was missing. There's a capacity I hadn't named, something that comes before tolerating discomfort, before rupture and repair, before understanding power, before grief, and before acting without guarantees. I think each of us has a changing capacity to receive reality. Life is astonishingly complex. We don't like that. We want the picture to resolve immediately. We want to know what we're looking at. We want the scene in front of us to become legible at a glance. Imagine the aperture on a camera. Open it wider and more light enters. More of reality becomes available. But open it too far and the image washes out. Everything turns white. The details disappear. Close it too tightly and very little light enters. Again, the details disappear. The goal isn't to let in the most light. The goal is to let in enough light for reality to come into focus. I notice my own camera changes settings all the time. A few days ago, I was thinking about Peter Thiel, democracy, artificial intelligence, immigration. My 20-year-old great-grandmother and her 6 kids, pregnant, crossing the Atlantic. And the nature of consciousness. The aperture was wide. And somehow I could hold all of it. Then the power went out. And 48 hours later, I'm standing in my kitchen wondering whether the cheddar cheese is still good. My world had become very small. Nothing about Peter Thiel had changed. Nothing about immigration had changed. Nothing about my grandmother had changed. I had changed. My camera settings had changed. Or, listen to this. Mike and I are driving home from a concert. He says, one sentence. One sentence. Suddenly, I can't see 15 years of marriage anymore. I can only see this one moment. The aperture has narrowed. The camera has changed settings. Then, 2 days later, I'm sitting in an audience. Chicago is playing. I am so upset that it's our anniversary and he's not acting right. Want me to leave? He asks. No, I want you to apologize, I say. And he apologizes. And suddenly I am softened, and the whole marriage comes back into view. Nothing about the marriage changed in those 15 minutes. The camera did. That's what I'm trying to point to. This matters because I think every ethical failure begins with an aperture problem. When the aperture narrows, certainty becomes comforting. The world simplifies. We can exhale. Good people, bad people, right, wrong, us, them. They're just sending people home. I think this whole thing with pronouns is stupid. This is obviously a vast criminal conspiracy. The complexity disappears because for one reason or another, we no longer have the capacity to hold it. Who among us hasn't done this? I certainly have. My tolerance for discomfort is very high when my drone footage is working well. I can see institutions and organizations, history and likelihoods, various people playing their parts. I can hold despair and hope in the same frame and remain steady. My ability to repair is at its weakest when I am certain I am right. Then I become so focused on the story of my correctness that I can no longer see the impact of my actions. So, no, you do not have to be a billionaire to lose the capacity to metabolize complexity. I can do it before breakfast. And there is another way to lose contact. Sometimes the aperture opens so wide that reality itself begins to dissolve. Everything connects to everything else. Every event becomes part of an enormous theory. A grand unifying theory. I alone can see it. Let me map it out for my whole crew. The people inhabiting the map disappear beneath systems, history, technology, civilization, and ideology. The map becomes increasingly elaborate, while the ones living in the territory quietly disappear. That is not wisdom. That's just unethical. That's what that is. So the capacity for complexity is not in the ability to think about more things. It's the ability to admit more complexity while remaining in contact with reality. Reality is almost always more complicated than my first opinion. Reality is almost always more complicated than my tribe's opinion. Reality is almost always more complicated than the algorithm wants it to be. And when something does not sound quite right, that may be the moment to pause. Use discernment. Adjust the aperture. And look again. The more I've thought about this, the less I think it has anything to do with intelligence. I've met brilliant people whose aperture collapses the moment their worldview is threatened. I've met people with very little formal education who can sit quietly with contradiction for years. That is not IQ. It isn't education. It isn't politics. It isn't spirituality. It's something else. It's a relationship to reality itself, maybe. And I think maybe this is why I no longer think ethical adulthood begins by asking, what should I do? I think it begins one step earlier. How much reality can I bear to see right now? Because if I can't bear reality, I'll replace it with certainty, with ideology, with optimism, with cynicism, with conspiracy, with outrage, with whatever allows my nervous system to stop lighting up like a Christmas tree. And here's the humbling part. This aperture doesn't belong entirely to me. It changes with sleep, with hormones, with grief, with blood sugar, with trauma, with safety. There's growing evidence that thoughts, emotions, and impulses arrive before we claim ownership of them. So perhaps the miracle isn't that we choose wisely. Perhaps the miracle is that every once in a while we notice, oh, my aperture has narrowed. Or, oh, I've been looking through the drone lens again. Or, I've mistaken this close-up for the whole landscape. That moment of noticing may be where ethical adulthood actually begins. I don't think this capacity is something we achieve once and for all. I think we're more like photographers. Each scene asks something different. Sometimes the moment calls for the intimacy of a blade of grass. Sometimes it asks for the whole forest. Sometimes the drone, sometimes the sidewalk. The work isn't to master the camera. The work is to remain in right relationship with it. Not because complexity is always good, and not because certainty is always bad, but because every photograph will leave something outside the frame. Let me not forget that. Reality deserves my best attempt to see it clearly. The capacity for complexity is the capacity to let reality be more complicated than we wish it were, without losing contact with the people who have to live inside it. Can I widen my aperture without ever losing the human being standing in front of me? I think that's capacity zero. Thanks for listening. I'm Andrea Fiondo. I'll see you next time.